Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl, aka Artsy Island Girl for Pajama Crafter Stamps. Today I'm sharing a watercolor See You Soon retirement card. Now the retirement sentiment is on the inside of the card, so you can easily change up this card to have any sentiment you want in it. I'm going to be using the See You Soon stamp set from Pajama Crafter Stamps, as well as the Mix and Match Celebration stamp set. Now this set here has a lot of different sentiment options. There are individual words for the most part, so you can pick and choose and mix and match those sentiments to create the sentiment that you want. I'm using some nice bright white watercolor cardstock for my watercolor background. I like the bright white most of the time because you get true colors to what you're watercoloring. You could also use the cream-based ones if you prefer that or if that's what you have. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm positioning everything on that watercolor cardstock where I want them to go. I'm using my Misty stamping tool because I'm going to be stamping in different phases for this particular card. And the reason for that is because I want my embossing for this card to be in different colors of embossing powder. And then the water, I'm going to wait till after it's watercolored. And by the time we get to that point, you'll see why I'm waiting for that once I do that. So I laid everything out because I want to know that it's all going to fit in the space, and I want to make sure that I have the space between the water and the bottom part of the stamp correct. I use a little bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock. This way, when I stamp with the Versamark ink and put my embossing powder on top of it, it's really only going to stick to that Versamark ink, where it's not going to stick to other pieces or other parts of that cardstock. If by chance you get your water or your embossing powder sticking somewhere else, you can always use a soft brush to brush that off. So I stamped just the bottom stamp there. I have a little, it's actually a Slurpee straw, you could use a spoon here, that I'm using for the embossing powder, and that was because I had intended to do this bottom part in a two-tone. I wanted to do the grass in green and the trail and fence posts in brown embossing powder. However, I really couldn't see where that stamped image was. Some papers you can see the glossy stamped image from Versamark ink. For this watercolor cardstock, it's really hard to see, so I ended up just doing that entire bottom part with that green embossing powder, and it worked just fine. It didn't really need to be the brown. I think what the final result is nice anyways. We can use our embossing tool to melt that powder in place, and I always tilt it into the light as I'm embossing it just to make sure that everything has melted. With that piece done, I can put it right back into my stamping positioner, my Misty, and I can remove that bottom stamp. I'm done with it. I don't need it anymore, so I can take that off. Now I'm going to stamp the birds at the top. For this one, I want to use a gray embossing powder for them. You could always use black if you want the silhouette to be a little bit more bold on that background. I thought if I used black, it was going to kind of distract from the rest of the scene though, so I chose a gray because you'll still see those silhouettes. They'll still be prominent from the sky, but it's not quite as much of a contrast between the sky color. So I poured my gray embossing powder on there, used my embossing tool in order to melt that powder, and then we can put it right back into the stamping tool. You can see why a stamping tool like this is a lot handier when you're stamping, because you can position things and know it's going to be in exactly where you want it to go. For the water stamp, for this point, I'm just using a dye-based ink to stamp it. I just want to know where that water is for when I'm watercoloring. If I don't stamp it here, I have no idea exactly where that horizon is. I also have the waves that are in that stamp on, or I'm inking them and stamping it. This is a dye-based ink that I'm stamping with, and it is going to be diluted when I do my watercoloring. So we're going to get runny lines from this anyways. It's not going to stay a crisp stamped image with or when I'm watercoloring because it is water soluble. That's okay. All I want really is that horizon line. And if I still have a little bit of those wave lines while or once I'm done watercoloring, that's fantastic too. If I don't have any of those, that's totally fine. I just need to know where that horizon line is so that when I do the second stamping, after I'm all done my watercolor, I know that it's going to be positioned properly. So I'm using dye-based inks for my watercoloring here. These are re-inkers for dye-based pads. However, you can use whatever you want for your watercoloring. I like to use these simply because I already have them for inking or re-inking my dye-based pads. So it's a tool that I already have for something else, and I love being able to do more than one thing with any of my tools, really. I'm using a mixture of blues for the skies and the water, as well as a little bit of pink. I want this to look a little bit like sunset, just to have a little bit more color in the sky. My water is a little bit darker than my sky. I'm using the same colors, however, because I used that dark blue to stamp, so I knew where the horizon line was for my water, it is mixing in with the blues for that water, so it's just a little bit darker, so it has a bit of a different color tone to it. Anytime I'm watercoloring or ink blending, I really like to have a darker outer edge. I think it just frames it in a little bit more. So once I'm done with my lighter blues, I go in with a darker blue, and this happens to be the same color blue that I stamped with, and I do the upper part of my image as well as some of the outer sides there. Now, I've used this stamp set before with just some very simple ink blending to create a quick card that will give you a little bit more inspiration of another way to use this stamp set. I posted a picture of that in the Pajama Crafter Stamps Facebook group, so if you wanted to check out another way to use the stamp set, there is a picture of that posted in the group there. Once I'm done with my water, I can start using a light brown for my sand, as well as the path in that sand. And I am going right up to that water line. I don't mind if those two colors kind of blend together. I'm using fairly light colors with that brown, as well as the water line has kind of dried a little bit by now. So when I go right up to it, it's not really going to blend too much. If it bleeds a little bit, that's totally okay. It's kind of in the distance. And more of the front or the foreground of the image, as well as the pinks in the sky, I think are a little bit more eye-catching than that water line. Once I've done the sand part, I use a green color to color in the open areas of that grass. We have a lot of that area that is embossed with that green embossing powder, so there's not a lot of area to cover with this, but I do make it a lighter shade than the embossing powder, just so you see the different color tones with it. For my water, I want my water to have some shimmer to it. So I'm using a mica powder here that has a binding agent in it that's activated with water, and I'm just going to watercolor right over top of the ink that I have there. That ink there is partially dried, so it's going to stay pretty much where it is. It might rehydrate and move just a little bit, but it's not going to move too much. Another option here would be if you have a shimmer spray, you could use that to watercolor all over top of it. You could spray it on your surface and then use your water brush to watercolor over top of it. Another option, if you have other types of mica powders, you could use that, but you would want to put a binding agent in there. Otherwise, once it's dry, it's just going to rub off. This, because of the binding agent in it, is not going to rub off, but it's going to give a really nice pearl shimmer to that water. So you're going to see a noticeable or more noticeable difference between the water and the sky. The last thing I want to do here is this grass has some flowers in it. I want them to show up on the grass, so I'm using a nice bright pink to color those in. I wanted to kind of mimic or coordinate with the pink in the sky. You could use a completely different color. I think purple would also be a fun one to use, but I wanted to kind of tie in that pink in the sky with the flowers as well. So I'm coloring those in, and now that I am pretty much done my watercoloring, I'm going to let this completely dry. I want it 100% dry. I want to make sure that there's no possible moisture left in here. So I left it for probably about an hour while I did other things around the house. Now that that is dry, I'm going to put this right back into my stamping tool, and I am going to stamp it with that Versamark ink again, and I'm going to emboss the water lines with holographic embossing powder. So this is an embossing powder. It doesn't have any color to it. It's basically like glitter embossing powder. So what this is going to do is it's going to give that all of those lines in that water glitter. It's going to make those really sparkle in the light. So we're going to get a combination of that pearly water shimmer, plus we're going to get the glitter sparkle for those wave lines. Now again, anywhere that embossing powder sticks that it's not supposed to, and the holographic tends to have, or it tends to hold static, so it does tend to stick other places. I'm just going to use a soft brush just to brush it away before I do any of the embossing. I don't want to melt it where I don't want it to go, so we want to brush that away. Then I use my embossing tool to melt that powder. Now I'm ready to start getting my piece ready for the front of my card. I have some arch dies. These are nesting dies that I have for my stash. You could use whatever shape you want here. It doesn't have to be arches at all, but I do like how those arches kind of arch with the colors in the sky there. I think it frames it really nicely. I'm going to put it through my die cutting machine. Now this set of arches that I chose, this particular die, is just a little bit smaller than an A2 card base. I'm going to be gluing this to an A2 card base, so I want to be able to see the white around that card base. Then I chose 2 other arches from that set. One is just a little bit smaller than the one I used for my background, and then the next one is just a bit smaller than that, and I taped them to some dark tealy blue cardstock that coordinates beautifully with the colors that I did my watercolor in. This is just going to add a frame to it. Again, this is a step that you could eliminate if you wanted to, but it just adds a really nice frame. It doesn't cover that scene at all. It just frames it really nicely and just adds an extra accent to it. Now at this point, I realized that I hadn't colored or watercolored my green outside of the lines, and I really wanted my colors to extend past that because this paper, this die cut, extends past my arch. So I just used a green ink pad that was a similar color tone to what I had watercolored and embossed with. And I just did a little quick ink blending just to fill that area in so it wasn't just the watercolor cardstock. Before assembling my card, I want to add my sentiment to the inside of my card. So I chose the happy retirement. And again, this is at this point, you could change it to whatever sentiment you want. I think this would be a lovely thinking of you or with sympathy or even a happy birthday. It would just be a great one for many different occasions, I think. Who doesn't love just a beach scene just to look at? So at this point, put it in your stamping tool and stamp whatever sentiment you're wanting on the inside. And I chose the same ink pad that I used for stamping my water before I did the watercolor. So I knew it was going to coordinate with the colors on the front of the card. Another option would be to use the green that I had ink blended with, but I really liked the blue tones. And then I glued this to the front of my card. I'm using some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine bottle. I use this glue for pretty much everything because it gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. It sticks really, really well. And then once it's stuck, it's good to go. I've never had anything fall apart with it. I also like to put a large acrylic block on top just to kind of weight everything down while it's drying. It frees up my hands for working on other things. Then I added that same glue to the back of our little arch frame here, and I centered that onto our scene, put that acrylic block right back on top of it just to hold that down while that glue dried. Now the last step here, I'm using some glitter glue just in the center of those flowers. Another option here would just to be use a glue pen and loose glitter if that's what your preference is or that's what you have. But it just touches or adds that sparkle to the center of the flowers and gives them something to sparkle about as well. Here is the finished card. Really the thing that took the longest was waiting for that watercolor to dry, but it's a great way to create a beautiful scene and perfect for many different occasions. I have all the Pajama Crafter stamp supplies that I've used listed in the description box below, so you'll be able to find those there. Look at our Facebook group. We always have inspiration on the Facebook group as well. So it's a great way to get inspiration for your Pajama Crafter stamps and see the different ways that people use them. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a fantastic day.